Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, today we have our returning champion, Dr. Alon Burstein, who's going to help us unpack all things in terms of Israel's judicial reform. And if you're like me and you've been paying any somewhat attention to news coming out of Israel over the past couple of months, you'll know that the amount of talk and also the amount of on-the-ground protests, both in Israel and also throughout Jewish enclaves in America, has been really at an all-time high. And so Dr. Alon will come and unpack all things judicial reform. Alon, welcome back to J Life with Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. Always a pleasure to be back.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll be able to have a little bit of fun while discussing a topic that I don't think is fun for anybody. For somebody that hasn't been paying any attention, what's been going on? What is this sort of big judicial reform that Israel's politicians are trying to do?
So trying to sum it up, a week after the government was established, and this was the beginning of January, the new Justice Minister, Yariv Levin from the Likud, announced a major judicial reform. The aim of this reform, according to the official reports at least, is to organize the between the judicial system, the judicial branch, and the government, and the Knesset, the legislative branch. In effect, what this reform does is a series of laws, which we can get into a little bit later, we'll get into the nitty-gritty, which are aimed to substantially weaken the Supreme Court and remove any restraint that the Supreme Court has on effective government action, or as is being termed in Israel, any restraint on the ability of the government to actually govern the way the people want.
Sure. And so just a little bit of a civics background for our listeners, right? And you can let me know if you fully agree or disagree with any of this, right? One of probably the main fundaments of what we consider to be a liberal democracy is a separation of powers, right? And the idea that you can have a democracy that's not liberal, right? You can have a political system where the majority vote gets in, and then whoever ends up prime minister, president, king, whatever you have, gets to basically do whatever they want, right? The idea of a liberal democracy, certainly what we have in America with the Constitution and separation of powers, means that you cannot have what's called tyranny of the majority. Taking sort of a wide step back, can you explain the situation in Israel and why Israel politics might be more susceptible to a lack of separation of powers from just the fundamentals of the government, and then how this might make it worse?
So I'll start by, I know you don't hear this often, I'll start by agreeing with you. And I'll say that one of the things that is often said in political science is that the extent of a democracy can be measured by the extent of separation of powers between different branches. So as you said, in places like Iran or Syria or Russia, they have elections as well. But the judicial branch that also approves, for example, who is allowed to run in elections, what is corruption, what is nepotism, are all controlled by the government. And therefore, when there's no separation of powers, you end up with a system of government where there are elections. So the government claims that its legitimacy comes from the people, but in fact, it controls all branches. So the extent of democracy is often measured by the extent of the separation.
Yeah, and it's worth just highlighting that, because even, just going on a complete tangent in terms of even American politics, right, and something that I think belies a lot of people's view in terms of what actually makes a country a democracy, right? It's not about the actual act of showing up to vote, right? That obviously is somewhat a part of it, but it really is about these wider governmental systems, right, in place, and how much power somebody can have once they actually get in charge.
Absolutely, because the idea is that, what does it mean, tyranny of the majority? It means that if everyone shows up to vote and a majority got 55% of the vote, they could then all of a sudden enact a law that would say, and from now on, only people from our ethnicity, or only people from our party, or only people from A, B, and C are allowed to vote, right? And they are doing that by majority. So that's a tyranny of the majority. So the idea is, in a liberal democracy, the idea is that there's a judiciary that has the authority to stop the government, to restrain it. That's a checks and balance system, to restrain the government from going about anything at once, which really gets us into the complexities of Israel. So there's two factors that really complicate the situation in Israel compared to the situation in the United States. The first is that Israel is a parliamentary democracy. So like most of the democratic world, unlike the United States, in Israel, the president is merely a ceremonial position, and who is the head of the executive branch is really a prime minister. And that prime minister is elected by having a majority in the legislature. So unlike in the American system, where you vote for a president and vote for someone in Congress, and they could be from two different parties, and the president can have no majority in Congress. In parliamentary systems, by definition, the prime minister has a majority in parliament. So already you have a much more weakened separation of powers between at least those two branches. And then the third branch is the judiciary, which, how does it enact government restraint? It enacts it usually based on a constitution. So constitution is theoretically a set of laws that stands above regular laws, above regular government acts. And the constitution is something against which laws or government acts are measured. And therefore, if the government all of a sudden decides, as happened in the United States, in recent years, if the government all of a sudden decides, if you're flying from a certain country, you're not allowed into the country, or A, B, and C, the court is allowed to say, no, that's unconstitutional. And even though you won an election, you can't do this because it violates the Constitution. Critically, Israel does not have a constitution, and therefore there's an entire different system which we can get into. I think it's very relevant, but I'll wait on that for a moment. But really, those two factors, the fact that Israel does not have a constitution, so there's no codified body that stands above regular government acts and sets of laws, and the fact that there's a parliamentary system, makes it much more complicated than the situation in the United States.
Yeah, so I definitely want to get into what Israel has instead in a minute. I also think it's important to flag, and something that I'll ask you in a couple minutes so you can get mentally prepared for the question of a lot of criticism of Israel's judiciary is actually based on the fact that because Israel has no constitution, in the words of a lot of people that are pro this reform, a lot of times it seems that the Supreme Court is sort of pulling things out of thin air because there isn't that strong basis. So we'll get to that in a minute and see if there is any validity to the people that are pushing this judicial reform. But before we get there, what are basic laws? How do they sort of function as a constitution, and what's going on there?
So when the country was founded in 1948, and really after the first elections in 1949, the elections were for a governing body whose sole job was to create a constitution. Wouldn't you know, you put a bunch of Jews together and tell them, so decide, what does it mean to be Israeli? What does it mean to be Jewish? Who's allowed in? Who's allowed out? What do you know? They disagreed. And eventually in 1950, they came up with a compromise that was called the Harari Compromise, which stated as follows. Instead of a constitution, the government or the Knesset will legislate sets of basic laws. These basic laws will gradually be brought together and be made into a constitution at an appropriate time. That leaves a lot of ambiguity. For example, when basic law government, which is a law that dictates what are the functions of government, what are the functions of ministers, how do you fire ministers, how do you appoint a cabinet, et cetera, et cetera. So when that was enacted in 1968, does that become a constitution automatically? Like, is every basic law automatically a constitutional article that then you can evaluate other laws compared to it? Or is it not? Or is it only when eventually this is codified together, do they become a constitution? So over the years, the Knesset enacted various different basic laws.
Which is also, of course, sorry to cut you off, but just based on my memory, it's also based on majority rule in the Knesset. Absolutely. In terms of enacting basic laws. So it's almost sort of a paradox in and of itself.
That's exactly part of the controversy, is that basic laws themselves are not entrenched. You could change a basic law based on any simple majority, and you can enact a basic law based on any simple majority. So part of the controversy does the Supreme Court have the right to say, well, what the government is now doing violates a basic law? Is that a constitution or is it not? That was left vague. The big change that occurred was in 1992, when two basic laws were enacted by the Knesset: Basic Law, Human Dignity and Freedom, and Basic Law, Freedom of Occupation. And those were unique because for the first time, there was an entrenchment clause put in them. Entrenching something means that you can't just change it at will. For one, that was in Basic Law, Freedom of Occupation. Or it means that this law can supersede other laws. And specifically, in Basic Law, Human Dignity and Freedom, it was stated that this law supersedes other laws that contradict it. No other law may violate it. And if such a violation does occur, it must be made explicit in the law, and it is only allowed to violate it to the extent that is required. And it is based on this that famously the Supreme Court Justice Alon Burstein declared the constitutional revolution has begun. It was because the Knesset enacted a law. It was not his decision, despite how it's been characterized historically. The Knesset decided on a basic law and said, we are now asking the court, you have the right to evaluate other laws and evaluate other actions, and if they contradict this law, then you have the right to shut them down. Or we can say, no, we're doing it even though it violates this, but you have the right to say, does it violate it to the right extent? So that is really where the controversy started. That's the big constitutional revolution that is often being referenced in 1992, 1995, when these basic laws were given this sort of elevated position.
Sure. So one of the things that, I mean, I don't think it's obviously just relegated to Israel. I think a lot of what we've seen in a lot of countries that are slipping away from liberal democracy, all throughout Europe and, even to some extent America is attempted to be a weakening of the separation of powers and a slide towards authoritarianism or something like that. And so this is definitely not new on the Israeli right. I mean, the Supreme Court, just for people who aren't familiar, and maybe you can get into a little bit deeper, right, has been sort of the liberal arm of the Israeli public, oftentimes being the voice that protects minorities, specifically Arabs, in a lot of, high stakes cases, especially when the IDF is involved and things like that, and really telling the Knesset or really the Israeli public that you actually have to legislate and hold these values across different religions and ethnicities. And so it's not news that the Israeli right has been increasingly upset at the Supreme Court. So what's been different in the past couple of months is sort of sowed the seeds for this attempted actually overhaul of the system.
So I'll back up for 2 steps. First, just a word about Israel's Supreme Court, because this is where it is slightly different than the American Supreme Court. Israel, because it functions based off of the British model, the Supreme Court also serves as what is called the High Court of Justice, which means that it's also a court of appeals, like in the American system. However, it is also a court in which anyone who has a claim against the state can file it and immediately goes to that court. So the same judges that sit in the Supreme Court sit in the High Court of Justice, and they rule if you have a claim against the state, your car was confiscated, and you think that the state violated your basic rights by doing that. Something happened like that, you will not go to a lower level court, you immediately go to the High Court of Justice, which is why the Supreme Court is sort of where everything's happening, so to speak.
Sure.
And one of the things that the Supreme Court did over the years, and this is really where it sort of became inflammatory towards or at least perceived as inflammatory towards the right, is it expanded what's called the right of standing, the right to appear before the court, to include issues that relate to the Palestinians also. So while Palestinians are not citizens, the court started accepting appeals saying, but if the Israeli army or the Israeli administration does something that violates Israeli laws, even if what it is doing is not directed towards citizens, it still has to uphold by Israeli laws. And that is where the court often gets this image of being very left-leaning, because when the IDF wants to confiscate a certain territory in the West Bank or build a separation barrier that goes through a Palestinian town or things like that, the court often is the one that says, no, you can't do that. And then it gets this image of being very left-wing. I will add that from a research analytical point of view, the court is extremely non-interventionist by comparative standards and extremely not biased towards left-wing. The court has protected settlers' rights. It has protected ultra-Orthodox rights in a lot of different ways. So when you actually break it down, despite its image, it actually has not been very favored in one direction or the other, but it did sort of garner this image. And really the laws that are hated by right-wing nationalists are basic law, human dignity and freedom, because it is based on that basic law that is seen as a Bill of Rights that the army and settler activity is often curtailed. So if settlers were to take over private land owned by Palestinians, the court, based on basic law, human dignity and freedom, will say this law can be extrapolated to also allow people freedom of property. So you can't take that over, even if you claim the security risk. Or critically, the court will say, well, the law says you can violate this law, but only to the extent necessary. So the court will ask the IDF, prove to me that this is necessary. Show me, if you're saying that this is a security risk, that's okay, we can do it in closed doors, it won't be public, but show me why this is a security risk. And very often the IDF fails to do that. And so that law has really become sort of the icon of like the court always rules against Israeli security and in favor of the left. And that is where a lot of the controversy comes from sort of the right-wing populists. Now, in answer to your question of
Sure. Well, you also, I mean, just to even
I
add,
didn't get your next question yet.
no, but
Pointing that
listen,
out.
I mean, just to even add one thing that, of course, I think is sort of the elephant in the room here, in terms of, we could probably talk endlessly about this idea of the fact that the Palestinians that are in both East Jerusalem and the West Bank, right, because they're not citizens, they do not have voting and democratic representation. And so you do have political advocates on the ground that are voting on behalf of and advocating on behalf of more right-wing positions. You probably have a lot fewer advocating on behalf of left wing, especially in terms of the West Bank positions. And so when the court does, even if they are doing sort of equal to the right and left, it's still going to seem uneven compared to the wider proportion of Israeli voters, because the voting account just excludes a certain percentage of people.
Absolutely. And in general, right, every country has its core priorities, its core values, its core belief systems that cannot be violated and supersede everything. And in Israel, matters of terrorism and security are ones that sort of supersede everything. They're ones that even the most staunch political rivals will come together and say, but at the end of the day, when you're fighting Hamas, we're all on one side. At the end of the day, when you're fighting Hezbollah, we're all on one side. So there is this image of like, but when you're fighting terrorism, quote unquote, you're all on the same side. But here is the court saying, no, you can't. For example, a law has been proposed now that is known as not going to pass the court. You can't deport the families of terrorists in order to create a deterrence. Mm-hmm. So that is a law that's being proposed by Itamar Ben-Gvir and Jewish Power that is already being spoken about, that obviously the court is going to strike this down. So that's why it also comes off as very much like the ethos of the country is protecting Jewish lives and fighting terrorism. And here's the court saying, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing, and then we can get back into the judiciary and sort of, go away from this tangent. But, one of the things that I'm always sort of talking to people when explaining to them this, difficult political situation that Israel has in terms of the West Bank and, a lot of what we might consider unjust about the situation is virtually all countries have this tension between freedom and security, right? In America, we have the same tension where obviously if we allow the government to spy on us 24/7, we will be, at least for a short amount of time, we will be safer because it'll be fewer people that are able to randomly, get guns and shoot up shopping malls if the police catch them before. We in America, we as in, the voting body and the Constitution and the way that our politics is geared, we've basically chosen to have slightly more freedoms at risk of a little bit less security. But to some extent, that is a question that you allow the voting basis of a country to have, right? It's sort of a privilege or a right of a citizen. One of the difficulties of Israel is the people in whose securities are restricted are not people who can vote. And right. So you have a body who's voting on this age-old dialectic of, repealing of freedoms for increased security, but their side is the one who's benefiting from the security while not being, while not losing any of the freedoms. And so it does create a very one-sided picture where you can see why, from just a social psychology perspective, right? It's not surprising that Israel's moved to the right on this issue because they don't sort of have the natural fallout that other democracies have in this situation. Okay, away from that tangent. So let's go back to the judiciary for a second.
So I'm actually going to build off that tangent.
Perfect.
So what happened in the last couple of months is following what was called change government, that for the first time last year, was a government that included an Arab Israeli party, and from a lot of right-wing elements was seen as sort of a heresy, a government that's selling out Israel's Judaism. It was one of the first times in the last 20 years, actually only the second time in the last 20 years, there was a government without the ultra-Orthodox. It was seen as a very secular, left-leaning government, et cetera, et cetera.
And it was the first time that you ever had a prime minister wearing a kippah and Shomer Shabbat.
Also true, but that's ignored because he is seen as a traitor and a racist and blah, 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 blah. So with all that, you're getting me off topic. So with all that, when the latest elections happened, much to some people's surprise, the parties Religious Zionism and Jewish Power, along with the Noam party, got 15 seats in the Knesset, and also the Orthodox party grew stronger. And along with the Likud, they were able to form a government. And each one of these parties has a vested interest right now. circumstantially right now in curtailing the Supreme Court. And I'll say again, even though the Supreme Court has protected each one of their populations in the past, right now, they each have a vested interest. So the ultra-Orthodox parties, what is at stake at the moment, what actually was one of the things that caused Netanyahu's government to fall in 2019, is questions about the legality of excluding ultra-Orthodox, mainly boys, from being drafted to the military. Right, this is sort of the key issue for ultra-Orthodox parties with Haredi parties, and the court keeps on saying what the government is proposing violates basic laws of lack of discrimination, because you can't say every Jew is required to go to the army, but you exclude certain people because they study Torah. Thus, the Orthodox Party have a vested interest in weakening the Supreme Court's ability to stop these laws. In turn, religious Zionism and Jewish power are two ultra-nationalists.
And this is a party that we discussed in a couple podcast episodes ago about Ben Gvir for listeners who want more background.
Absolutely. So these are two parties that have advocated blatantly racist policies towards Arabs and or have advocated to annex the West Bank, but create I'm sorry, this is an uncomfortable statement, create a quasi-apartheid regime whereby the West Bank would be annexed, but only Jews would be given citizenship and Arabs would enjoy all rights except for the right to vote. So they also know that won't pass the Supreme Court, so they have a vested interest in weakening the court. And in turn, you have the Likud, which is being led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who is currently in court on charges of bribery, breach of trust, and lots of other little things of general corruption. And he has his own interest in controlling the court system. So right now, there's this sort of unique circumstantial situation whereby the old Orthodox parties really don't care about annexing the West Bank, and Netanyahu really doesn't seem to care if old Orthodox boys are drafted or not. But each party has its vested interest in substantially curtailing the Supreme Court, and thus they put this reform together. Will this be a good time to say a couple of words about what the reform actually includes?
Yeah, so before we even go there, I would say, a lot of critics of the Supreme Court and the judiciary in Israel are not criticizing it, at least on paper, because of any of those three reasons, right? A lot of the things that people will point to, and let's try to steelman this argument for a second, is sort of, again, the erratic nature as to how people are appointed. And again, the fact that because there is a lot less of a constitution or foundational document, and also obviously compared to America, there are a lot fewer previous court cases based on a constitution to build off of, right? It's sort of you're building a constitutional system basically on a house of cards, and you're then looking for cases built on a house of cards for precedent in future cases, right? So you can understand why this is a system that would have a lot of criticism. So if you had to sort of steelman the side that is pro any type of reform, can you say a couple words there, even if you don't agree with this particular one?
Absolutely. I mean, as you just said, the fact that there's no constitution allows the court extensive leeway and extensive it gives every judge an extensive position to his or her own opinion, which then in Israel often at least they try to associate with their background. Is that judge a religious person? Is that judge, does it happen to be an Arab? Do they happen to be a settler? And the idea is that then, and we see this in the Supreme Court of the United States, right? The opinions of Supreme Court judges have a lot to do with the way they end up ruling. And part of the criticism, as you mentioned, is that judges historically have come from sort of the Ashkenazi secular elite predominantly. There are historically, obviously, a minority of women, a minority of Mizrahi or Sephardi people, a minority of Arabs, and a minority of religious people. And that judges all come from this sort of niche segment of the population, which by sheer characterization represents the more secular, the more pro-democratic versus pro-Jewish side of the equation. And therefore, it does not allow the government, even though the majority of people have voted for example, in the current coalition, the Likud, ultra-Orthodox, and ultra-national parties, that means the majority of the populace wants this. Here is a minority of judges with no constitution ruling based on what they deem is reasonable, what they deem violates the principles of basic laws, which themselves were not maybe meant to be a constitution yet or not, and deciding to curtail what the majority actually wants in a democratic system. So there's definitely there's definitely circumstantial evidence and a lot of rhetoric to say, look, it would be a more democratic system in lieu of a constitution to say, let the people govern the way the populace voted for the policies the populace wanted, and let the court judge based on what the populace determines the rules should be, as opposed to a minority of Ashkenazi secular elites judging based on what they think are the principles of democracy against what maybe the majority wants. There's definitely a case that could be made.
No, of course. And it also speaks to, I think, a little bit of the paradox or the difficulty of defending liberalism, because to some extent, liberalism might be classified as an ideology, but really it's to some extent the lack of an ideology, right? Yeah. And so, if you have one side that's pushing an ideology and another side without a clear-cut ideology that's defending what seems to be, if you're not a liberal, right? And I'm not using a liberal left and right, but like, sort of an old school liberal. If you're not an old school liberal, as very few ultra-Orthodox people are, as, much fewer of the Israeli voter basis, in the Mizrahi world are, right? It just seems like there are these sort of vague set of ideas that can't be even compiled into a explainable worldview. So I can understand, the perspective from some extent of somebody who criticizes the Supreme Court, which is, of course, when I just discussed this, out with, friends and colleagues of mine that are more sympathetic to these reforms, these reasons are all, front and foremost.
Well, let's take a moment to discuss one of the key elements of the reform, because maybe that'll help to say, okay, how could this be seen as positive or how could this be seen as negative?
Sure.
So the basic tenet of the reform, and since then they've added a couple of things, but when the reform was proposed, it primarily included four things, and I'll emphasize that this was phrased as phase one of a three-phase reform. So phase one, which is what's currently being debated, included four things. One was changing the composition of the committee that appoints judges, and critically, that also promotes judges. So right now, the composition includes 3 Supreme Court judges, 2 lawyers, members of the bar, and 4 politicians. So 9 in total, in which there's a majority of 5-4 to sort of judiciary. That does not mean, contrary to what is being said, that judges just appoint their friends. Actually, to appoint a Supreme Court judge, you need a majority of 7 in the committee. So you do need to cooperate with the politicians. But the first step of the reform is to change that committee such that it will have an absolute majority of coalition members, not politicians, but specifically members of the government. So that's step.
So in terms of our conversation before about centralization of powers and separation of powers, this would basically put, sort of similar to America, although you don't have the Constitution or Congress also on the other side, right? It would just be as if Congress and the president, right, which are by definition the same thing, get to appoint Supreme Court justices.
Absolutely. Not even, you could take Congress out of the equation in the comparison to America. It would be if the president got a majority vote, then the president can appoint anyone they want to the court and also control if that person is promoted among the different court systems, which is important for reasons we can get to later. So that's one of the steps. A second step, in every government ministry in Israel, there's a legal counselor whose job is to restrain the minister if the minister tries to do something illegal. So if you are, let's take it away from the Palestinian case. If you are a minister of health and you think it may be popular, or even you think it's the right policy to say, I want to close down, Jerusalem has 3 hospitals. Why should one city have 3 hospitals? I'm going to close down one of them and simply open up another hospital somewhere in the periphery. It is the job of the legal counselor to come and say, no, you can't just do that on your whim. There are labor laws. There's law of freedom of occupation. There's different agreements, etc. So the legal counselor can restrain the minister. The second clause in the judicial reform is to remove that authority. Legal counselors in ministry's position will be advisory only, and the minister can do whatever she or he want. The third step is removing what's called the clause of reasonableness. So again, Supreme Court judges are allowed to.
It's always great when a politician wants to remove a clause of reasonableness.
Indeed, especially again in a parliamentary system. So removing the clause of reasonableness is something that the Supreme Court has in order to evaluate the reasonableness of government actions. So again, if the government during COVID restrictions all of a sudden decides not only you're not allowed to leave your house, but suppose you're not allowed to turn on electricity, you're not allowed to turn on the faucet, you're not allowed to all kinds of things, the court uses this clause, again specifically the High Court of Justice, uses this clause to say, no, even though you're violating basic law, human dignity and freedom, this goes too far. You can do so, but only within the frame of reasonableness. Removing that, saying judges can no longer rule according to that.
Which again is highly subjective, but it's still important to have that backdrop in a governmental system. So it again
Absolutely.
gets to this tension of,
Well, this is why I said
you know,
let's go through these things, and then you can see the pro and con.
My reasonableness is not your reasonableness, and it's not an ultra orthodox guy's and B'nai Barak's reasonableness. And so, right, you can again see how this very quickly, falls into debate. But anyway, continue with
the fourth thing, which is the most controversial one, in my opinion, wrongly. I think some of the other ones are worse, but the one that's getting the most hype is what's called the override clause. And the override clause is basically adjusting the law to say that the Knesset can legislate a law or just any government act, and if the Supreme Court overrules it, the Knesset can overrule in return the Supreme Court's action, the Supreme Court's restraint, with a simple 61 majority. And why that's important is because in order to form a government in Israel, you have to have a 61 majority. So by definition, every government has a 61 majority. So again, if I am the prime minister, that means that I have a 61 majority in the Knesset with my coalition. So I decide tomorrow that we are going to declare war on the United States, and we're going to, I have no idea, violate every agreement that we have. And the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that. This violates our basic laws of A, B, and C. So I can go back to the Knesset and say, no, we're overriding that. We are sending back, we're reinstating this law. And they've changed it a little bit to be almost preemptive, that you can enact a government action and put into the action that if the Supreme Court were to override this, we're already preemptively canceling that.
So it completely defangs any power that the Supreme Court has and makes it basically ceremonial.
Exactly. It removes all possible restraint on government. And now we can talk a little bit about the pros and cons, right? So if you were looking at this, as you were saying, from a more pro, in this case, right-wing agenda, you would say, well, in fact, the court is there to rule based on the set of laws that are enacted by the legislature. The legislature is a Knesset. It is elected by popular vote. And in fact, if the legislature appoints a government and that government wants to enact A, B, and C laws, yes, the judiciary should not be allowed to stop it. Should not be allowed to say this act is unconstitutional because there is no constitution. Should not be allowed to say this act is not reasonable. Well, the people think it's reasonable. They voted for these. They put these people in power. Therefore, it should be A, B, and C. So, from that perspective, it sounds good. The fact is, and this is what I'm often challenging people, and I'm sure it has come out that I am staunchly against these reforms. I often challenge people who are pro the reforms and usually on the right side of the map. I say, if you're pro the reforms, could you honestly say that you would be pro these reforms if they were being enacted by the previous government? Because from the right-wing perspective, you might be pro the reforms currently, but theoretically, if these reforms are passed, if a left-wing government's in power, they could decide tomorrow that they're dismantling all settlements, and any settler who was previously in the West Bank is now going to be sent to jail for 5 years for violating the rights of Palestinians. And the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that. The government actually sent them there. This was legal. You could simply override that back. There's effectively no restraint on the government if these reforms pass. And I'll just add, because very often it's being compared, and they're trying, as they sell these reforms, to say, but look, in the United States, it is the political establishment that appoints judges. Or they're trying to say, but look, in various different countries, there is no clause of reasonableness. Israel does not have any of the other government restraints that lots of other countries have. Israel has only one house. There is no upper house. It's all the Knesset. So there's no extra restraint on what the Knesset does. In Israel, only the Supreme Court is allowed to restrain government action. So unlike in the United States, when any court can stop a government act if it is deemed to violate the Constitution, in Israel, that's not the case. It is only this panel of 15 judges that can have any restraint. Israel is not a federal system, so there is no different division between different branches of government. And finally, lately it's being compared to Britain. Israel is not part of any international court system. So unlike in Europe, where you have the European Commission of Human Rights, where you have the European court system, there is effectively no restraint on Israel's government today, with the exception of the Supreme Court. So removing this sounds popular because it's pro-democratic, but again, what that means is that this democratic majority could, in theory, tomorrow, if these reforms pass, legislate, and from now on, we're not going to have elections every 4 years, it's going to be elections every 8 years, and there's no legal restraint on that. There's nothing that can stop them from just changing the law at will if the court has no ability to come back and say, no, you can't do that.
Sure. And so obviously, just in the last couple of weeks, right, we've seen sort of the backlash in wider Israeli society, right? I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Israel has seen the widest and, most attendees of protests really in its history, wrote, not just in places like Tel Aviv, but really in all the major cities. You've obviously heard from more American Jewish organizations about this than probably ever in terms of publicly coming out and criticizing Israel. And one of the things that I also think is interesting, just from various news sources, is even a lot of people who voted for various right-wing parties are actually coming out publicly against this. Do we have any numbers right now? Right, we're talking here. It is Monday, February 27th. Do we know any sort of polling data or anything, in terms of where the Israeli public is right now on this?
So polling data, I mean, obviously is very skewed. And I will just add that, while these demonstrations are some of the biggest that we've seen, they're not the biggest historically. They're close to. And there's rumors that the next demonstration set next Saturday is expected to be the biggest. But some of the biggest protests happened in 1984, 85 against the Lebanon War, and then against this engagement in 2005, just as a point of interest. I've been trying to convince Daniel to attend my social mobilization in Israel course.
Oh, there we go.
But in terms of polling data of where the Israeli populace stands, the majority, according to the polls that are being conducted, the majority of the population is sort of either staunchly against this or mildly against this. So in the general population, I believe I saw somewhere that 55 or 60% said that they're staunchly against this, but that of course includes people, the 50% who voted against this government. So that's not surprising. Of Likud voters, of the voters who actually in elections a couple of months ago put Netanyahu in power, 60% either said that the government should halt what they're doing until there's an agreement reached with the opposition, or were staunchly against this, all told. So there is a majority in the populace who, at least according to polling data, is against what's happening. It's noteworthy, though, to add that in polls in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox are wildly underrepresented. So when you look at polling data, you have to remember that there is a segment of 10 to 13% of the population that would probably be very, very pro that is not represented. And the settler population often is not represented either, or underrepresented. And they too would be largely pro. So while it seems that there's overwhelmingly against, I would bet that it's more in the 55 to 60% all told.
So all of the general pathologies of polling that happens in liberal countries, basically, of people with certain political dispositions being less likely to answer pollsters.
Absolutely. What is, though, interesting in the Israeli case is that very often the ethnic groups or geographic groups, or more ethnic groups that don't answer polls, you tend to be able to identify what they would usually vote for. So again, we have the ultra-Orthodox, we have the Arab Israeli population. You tend to be able to know where they would stand on, where the majority of them would stand on most of these different issues. And that's why I'm saying the fact that 10 to 13% of the Haredi population is not represented, it's not an unreasonable guess to say that probably 85% of them are pro these reforms.
Yeah, 100%. So we should also just point out, we are recording on February 27th here, that, sort of running parallel to everything that's been happening in terms of the political and social, turmoil in Israel over the past couple of weeks, we've also seen a major spike in both terrorist attacks against, Jewish Israelis. And then also, I think just 24 hours ago, there was a pogrom perpetuated by settlers in a Palestinian village. And so, things are really heating up. Do you want to just say for a minute or two in terms of the rising tensions that's happening there, and if and how it is connected to, the recent government election activity?
So when this government came to power, they put Itamar Ben-Gvir, who we've discussed in the past, sort of ultra-nationalist, Kahanist, in charge of, they created a ministry that they called the Minister of National Security. And so this is a person who in the past been convicted of incitement for terrorism against Arabs and being a member of a terrorist organization against Arabs, and he is now head of national security. And Bezalel Smotrich, who in the past has also advocated, for example, for racial separation between Jews and Arabs and lots of other things like that. He's what's called a minister in the Ministry of Defense. So he's not the Minister of Defense, but a sort of beneath him.
Mm-hmm.
But he's supposed to be given authority over the civil administration, which is really authority over what goes on in the Palestinian territories. The mere positioning of those two people in those sort of very tenuous positions of power was already a clear sort of threat or sign to Palestinians that bad times are ahead. So that's one of the things that created sort of heightened tensions in the Palestinian side on the ground. Now, alongside that, both of those ministers and in general their parties made outlandish promises throughout their campaigns that if we put us in power, the Arabs will know their place, there will be security in the streets, every Jew is going to be able to settle wherever they want, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out when they came to power, they can't deliver. They can't deliver that fast. You can't change everything. Gideon Sa'ar, who was a minister in the previous government, when he left his position, he's quoted famously as saying, the biggest opposition to this incoming government is simply going to be reality. It's simply going to be a situation where they come to power, and it turns out that Israel depends very heavily on the international system and very heavily on American support, and they can't just annex the West Bank and say they don't care about the UN, they don't care about the United States. They can't just go and restore quote-unquote deterrence against the Palestinians by wiping out a village. They can't, all kinds of things. And there's sort of break of rising expectations that a lot of right-wing hawkish settlers and settlements perceived that with this government that until now has been always not completely right-wing, because it was Netanyahu governments, but coalitions with more left-wing parties, or restrained by the courts, that now all of a sudden there's going to be this ultra right-wing government, and it's going to be this era of paradise for the right wing. And it turns out that it's not. It turns out that there's just as much tensions. Turns out there's a lot of terror activity going on from East Jerusalem, and turns out Itamar Ben-Gvir can't solve it in a blink of an eye. And it turns out that even though now it's a completely right-wing government, they're actually not approving sort of sweeping approvals of settlements across the West Bank. And this has really created a lot of aggravation on the settler right-wing side, creating more vigilante violence too. Those two things coming together from the Palestinian side, from the settler side, has produced this violence. It's simply a fact that there has been increased terror from the Palestinian side. In trying to showcase that the government is doing something, Itamar Ben-Gvir has sent troops in to demolish an illegal home in East Jerusalem, which had nothing to do with quelling terrorism, but he made sure there was camera crews and photo ops in order, because he needs to show that he's changing the policies and causing deterrence. This causes more terrorism, which in turn inflames a lot of hawkish right-wing elements in Israel, saying, well, where's our totally pure right-wing government? And the result is this, forgive me, shit show. It's also a case that's leading up to Ramadan right now in 3 weeks, which is in general a heightened time when Hamas usually inflames, sort of plays the religious card and inflames the West Bank. And yeah, it's really a conglomeration of things coming together. But I would say primarily it's that there's a lot of inflammatory right-wing rhetoric on the one hand, without a lot of ability to deliver on the other, which is what's producing fear on the Palestinian side, which results in terrorism, and in turn, aggravation on the hawkish settler side, which results in counter-violence.
Sure. And I would just say, just for the listeners, some things to look out for over the next couple of weeks. One is just, again, this, endless cycle of violence. I think Amos Oz coined the term the Chag HaYam machine, after the famous song at the end of the Passover Seder, where you say, the cat and the dog hit the cat and the stick hit the dog and then the water hit the stick, right? So he, famously referred to this, cycles of violence, very apt metaphor. And then also, as you were sort of alluding to before, some of the cracks that might be starting to form in this sort of myth of, this right-wing utopian government that's going to fix everything. We will be sure to have you back on when, the next political situation happens in Israel, which, hopefully for all of our sakes will not be next Tuesday. But is there anything else that you think that we missed, or anything else that you wanted to touch on before we end today?
So 2 quick things. One, in terms of the judicial reform, or actually I'll combine them. if we look at the history of Netanyahu's governments, and he's been in power with the exception of 1 year, consecutively since 2009, Benjamin Netanyahu favors above all the status quo. He preaches right-wing politics. Under his government, there's been the longest freeze of settlement policies. He preaches that you should take down Hamas and retake the Gaza Strip. And under his government, Hamas has been allowed to be propped up. He has agreed to have Qatar fund Hamas, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's just interesting to point out that, like, as far as he is concerned, this, and there's a lot of sort of talk about this in the Israeli media, he hates his government. He really wants to lead it. It's more important for him to be in charge, but he wishes that the right-wing elements of the government would stop sort of pouring fuel on the fire, because as far as he's concerned, what's important to him right now is to maintain the status quo, and specifically for his court proceedings, to possibly change the law so that the government can control who are going to be the Supreme Court judges who will eventually possibly be judging his appeal. The same goes for the judicial reform. That's why I said it was two things. Actually, it's the same thing at the end of the day. There's a lot of rumors that Netanyahu himself really didn't want this overarching judicial reform that would completely cripple the court system. All he wanted was a reform that would change the committee that appoints judges so that he would have more control over who's going to appoint judges later. But his coalition has dragged him down this rabbit hole that really it's impossible to know how we're going to get out of. So it's impossible to know what's going to be. Netanyahu is trying very hard to, on the one hand, send delegates to, this happened yesterday, send delegates to Aqaba to meet with Palestinians in order to arrange some sort of quieting of the area, while his ministers are going to illegal settlements and saying, we're going to continue building no matter what they say in Aqaba. He's trying very hard to balance these two situations and just stay in power right now. It'll be interesting to see if he succeeds. He is a political wizard. He's proven that in the past. So I'm looking forward to seeing how he manages to succeed.
Well, Dr. Alon Burstein, thank you so much for coming back on J Live with Daniel.
Thank you.
Do